The sky turned brown before it turned black, and Caroline Graves knew exactly what that meant. She was already running. Her boots struck the hard Kansas earth in a rhythm that matched the hammering of her own heart, her leather satchel of specimens and notebooks bouncing against her hip as she tore across the open field toward the amber waves of Clayton Dunlap's wheat. She had seen the cloud forming on the eastern horizon 20 minutes ago, had recognized its particular density and movement with a cold certainty that turned her blood to ice water. 20 years of study, 3 years in the field, and one very terrible summer in Nebraska had burned the shape of that cloud into her memory like a brand. Rocky Mountain locusts, Melanoplis spreadus, a plague so vast and so devastating that it could strip every living green thing from an acre of land in under 4 minutes. And Clayton Dunlap's wheat field stretched across 400 acres. She burst through the gate of the Dunlap ranch yard just as Clayton himself emerged from the barn, his broad frame filling the doorway, hat pushed back on his head as he squinted at the horizon with the casual confusion of a man who had never faced this particular demon. "Miss Graves." His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man who did not panic easily. "What in the—" "We do not have time," she said, grabbing his arm, and the sheer force of her grip made him blink. "Listen to me very carefully, Clayton. That cloud is locusts. If they land on your wheat before we treat it, you will lose everything. Every stalk, every grain, every dollar you have sunk into this harvest. Your ranch, your debts, everything. Do you understand me?" He stared at her. He stared at the horizon. He stared back at her. "That is impossible," he said. "Locust swarms do not come this far west in." "They came this far west in 1874 and wiped out crops from Colorado to Missouri," she cut him off, her voice like a blade. "I have the field records, I have the specimen data, and I have approximately 45 minutes before that swarm reaches your eastern field. Now are you going to stand there and argue with me, or are you going to help me save your harvest?" Something shifted in his face then. Something dark and guarded gave way to something she had not expected to see in those storm-gray eyes of his. "Trust. Tell me what to do," Clayton Dunlap said, and that was how it began. Not with a soft glance across a church pew, not with a polite introduction at a social, but with a plague cloud on the horizon and 45 minutes to save everything a man had ever worked for. But to understand how Caroline Graves came to be standing in Clayton Dunlap's ranch yard with her hand on his arm, and her heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with locusts, you have to go back 3 weeks. Back to the day she arrived in Millhaven, Kansas, with her notebooks, her microscope, and her absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. The Kansas Pacific Railroad had deposited Caroline at the Millhaven Depot on a Thursday morning in the last week of July, 1876. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a botanist father and a schoolteacher mother, and she had spent the last 3 years working as a field agronomist for the Kansas State Agricultural Board, which was a position that most people in most towns could not quite make sense of. A woman who studied soil and crops and insects and weather patterns in a systematic and scientific way was not something the frontier had a ready category for, and Caroline had long since stopped expecting it too. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself as though she were, straight-backed and deliberate in her movements, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned practically beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat and sharp green eyes that missed very little. Her hands were not soft. They were the hands of someone who spent genuine time in fields, stained sometimes with soil or plant matter, calloused in the right places. She wore practical clothing, a divided skirt that allowed for actual movement and a linen blouse, both cut for work rather than appearance, and she had been told more than once that she dressed like she intended to be taken seriously, which she had always considered a compliment even when it was not meant as one. Millhaven was a town of maybe 300 souls, sitting on a flat expanse of central Kansas that rolled out in every direction like a rumpled brown blanket. It had 2 saloons, a general store, a church, a livery, a small hotel, and enough wheat fields on its outskirts to make it the kind of place the Kansas State Agricultural Board considered worth investigating. There had been reports of unusual soil conditions, reports of crop yields that varied wildly between neighboring farms with no obvious explanation, the kind of agricultural mystery that Caroline Graves lived to solve. She had arranged to board with Mrs. Elsa Prout, the widow who ran the hotel and who had been recommended in the Agricultural Board's correspondence as a woman of good sense and excellent cooking. Mrs. Prout was both of these things, and she was also possessed of the particular frontier skill of assessing a new person entirely within the first 30 seconds of meeting them, after which assessment she either accepted or dismissed them with equal efficiency. She accepted Caroline within 15 seconds. "You know what you are about," Mrs. Prout said, watching Caroline unpack her field equipment with methodical precision. "Most women who come through here are looking for something or running from something. You look like you are here to work." "I am here to work," Caroline confirmed. "Good," said Mrs. Prout. "Then you will want to know that the man with the most land and the most problems in this county is Clayton Dunlap, whose ranch sits 3 miles east of town on the Millhaven Creek Road. He runs cattle on the western portion and has been converting the eastern portion to wheat for the last 2 years at the insistence of his bank note. He is proud, he is stubborn, and he does not like being told what to do by anyone who has not first earned his respect." Caroline looked up from her unpacking. "That sounds like a challenge." "It is a warning," said Mrs. Prout, but she was smiling slightly. Clayton Dunlap's reputation in Millhaven was the kind that accumulated over years of being consistently what people expected a man to be in that particular landscape. He had come to Kansas from Texas 11 years ago at the age of 23, which meant he was 34 now and old enough to have made several significant decisions and lived with their consequences. He had purchased the land along Millhaven Creek with money he had saved working cattle drives, had built the ranch house with his own hands and the help of a few good neighbors, and had run cattle successfully enough to stay solvent through several hard years. The wheat conversion had been the bank's idea, presented to him as the future of Kansas agriculture during a year when beef prices dropped and wheat prices rose. Clayton had agreed to it with the particular combination of pragmatism and reluctance that characterized most of his decisions, and he had spent the last 2 years learning the difference between what he knew about land and what he did not know about crops. It was a difference that had cost him money and sleep in roughly equal measure. He was not a man who asked for help easily. He was not a man who asked for anything easily, and the people of Millhaven understood this about him and worked around it the way you work around a boulder in a field, not trying to move it, just plotting your course accordingly. Caroline met him on her second day in Millhaven, and it did not go well. She had ridden out to the Dunlap ranch on a borrowed horse, her satchel full of soil sampling equipment and her notebook already open to a fresh page, with a letter of introduction from the Kansas State Agricultural Board folded in her breast pocket. She had knocked on the ranch house door with the professional confidence of someone who had done this 30 times in the last 3 years, and found it got easier each time only if you did not let the first 60 seconds rattle you. Clayton answered the door in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair damp as though he had recently washed his face, a coffee cup in one hand, and a look of mild irritation that suggested he had been interrupted in something. He was larger than she had expected, broad across the chest and shoulders in a way that spoke of actual physical labor rather than mere size, with a jaw that had seen better days and a straight nose that had probably been broken at some point. His eyes were the color of an approaching storm front, that particular gray that could go either way. He looked at her for a moment with an expression of complete blankness, as though his mind was cycling through categories and not finding one that fit. "Mr. Dunlap," she said, holding out the letter. "My name is Caroline Graves. I am a field agronomist with the Kansas State Agricultural Board." I have been sent to conduct a survey of soil and crop conditions in this county, and given the scale of your wheat conversion, your property is the most significant site in the region. I would appreciate your permission to take soil samples from your eastern fields and to review whatever crop records you have maintained. He took the letter. He read it. He looked back at her. Agronomist, he said, as though he were trying the word in his mouth like a piece of food he was not sure about. A specialist in crop science and soil science, she said pleasantly. I study why crops succeed or fail and what can be done to improve conditions. Think of me as a doctor for your fields. I have managed my land for 11 years, he said. You have managed cattle for 11 years, she corrected, because she could not help it. It was a factual distinction. The wheat is 2 years old, and your eastern field yields are 17% below what your soil composition should support. I noticed the discoloration of your eastern boundary stalks from the road yesterday, and the pattern is consistent with a mineral deficiency that is entirely correctable. The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. You can see crop problems from a road, he said flatly. I can see certain indicators, she said. To confirm them, I need to take samples, which is why I am here. Another pause. The coffee cup in his hand was steaming gently in the morning air. Come back tomorrow, he said. I will have the eastern field hands clear of it by 8 in the morning. It was not a welcome exactly, but it was not a refusal, and Caroline knew the difference. She came back the next morning at 7:55 because she was always 5 minutes early, and she found Clayton Dunlap already in the eastern field himself, which was not what she had expected. She had expected to find a field hand or perhaps no one at all. Instead, she found the rancher himself, standing at the edge of his wheat with his arms crossed and his hat shading his face, looking at his crop with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man who was worried and was not yet willing to admit it even to himself. She did not comment on this. She just began her work. She took soil samples at intervals across the field, using a core sampling tool to extract cylinders of earth at various depths, labeling each sample with its precise location and depth in her field notebook with the efficient shorthand she had developed over 3 years. She examined the root systems of several wheat plants, pulling them carefully from the earth and studying them with her hand lens. She noted the color variations in the stalks at different areas of the field, the subtle differences in head development, the small but telling details that told a coherent story to someone who knew how to read them. Clayton watched her for the first hour without saying anything. The second hour, he started asking questions. Not polite questions, not the kind of half-engaged questions a man asks because he feels he should. Real questions. Pointed ones. The kind that revealed he had been thinking hard about what she was doing and had genuine things he wanted to understand. The discolored patches on the north end, he said, appearing at her shoulder without warning in the way large men sometimes moved quietly. They have been there since spring. I thought it was water drainage. The drainage is part of it, she said, not looking up from the root system she was examining. But the drainage issue is caused by a hardpan layer approximately 18 inches down that is trapping water and creating anaerobic conditions in the root zone. The mineral deficiency is a symptom, not the primary problem. Anaerobic, he said. Oxygen depleted, she said. Plant roots cannot absorb nutrients properly in waterlogged, oxygen-depleted soil. Your wheat is essentially starving in the midst of plenty. She glanced up then and found him looking at the discolored patch with an expression that was almost pained. There was something about the way he looked at his land, she thought, that was entirely different from the way a man looked at a business investment. It was personal in a way that went deeper than money, and she filed that observation away in the notebook of her mind. Can it be fixed? He asked. Yes, she said. It will require some work. We need to break up the hardpan with deep tilling in late fall, after harvest, and then amend the soil with a combination of sulfur and ground bone meal to correct the pH and mineral balance. In the meantime, I can prescribe a surface treatment that will improve this year's yield on the affected areas by perhaps 8 to 10%, which is not a complete solution, but it is better than nothing. He was quiet for a moment. You know all of this from dirt and roots. I know all of this from 3 years of field work and the research of a great many people who spent their lives understanding how plants grow, she said. I am just the person who applies it. Modest, he said, and there was something in his voice she could not quite read. Accurate, she said. That afternoon, when the heat of the Kansas summer was at its most relentless and the air shimmered over the wheat fields like something alive, Clayton Dunlap brought her a tin cup of water from the well without being asked and set it on the fence post nearest to where she was working. He did not make a production of it. He just set it there and walked back to what he was doing, and Caroline looked at that cup of water for a moment before she picked it up and drank it. It was a small thing, but small things, she had learned, were often where the real information lived. She spent the next 3 weeks working the county, visiting farms, taking samples, writing reports. She attended the weekly meeting at the feed store where the farmers gathered to discuss conditions, and she sat in the back with her notebook and listened for the first meeting before she said anything. At the second meeting, she spoke, and what she said was specific and practical and based on observable data, and several of the farmers leaned forward in their chairs in the way people do when someone is telling them something they can actually use. She went back to the Dunlap ranch every few days, checking on the soil samples she had left to incubate, adjusting her analysis as more data came in. Clayton was always there, always at work at something, the ranch running with the particular steady efficiency of a man who understood systems and kept them running through consistent daily attention. He had help, 2 full-time ranch hands named Pete and an older man called Jeb who had been with the ranch for years, but Clayton was not the kind of owner who directed from a distance. He was in the middle of it. She noticed, without meaning to notice, the way he moved through his work. The quiet competence of it, the absence of waste in his movements, the way he seemed to be always aware of what was happening around him without appearing to watch. She noticed the way he treated Pete and Jeb, with a directness that was not unkind, with a fairness that was evident in the fact that both men had been with him for years and showed no inclination to leave. She also noticed the empty side of the house. There was no woman at the Dunlap ranch. Mrs. Prout had told her this without being asked, in the way Mrs. Prout conveyed necessary information. Clayton had come close to marrying twice, once in his early years in Kansas, when a girl named Rosalind had decided that ranch life was not what she had imagined, and once more recently with a woman from Topeka who had not lasted even a season out here. After the second time, people had stopped suggesting it, and Clayton had stopped entertaining the idea, and there was a quality to his solitude that suggested he had made a kind of peace with it that was not entirely peaceful. Caroline understood something about making peace with things that were not entirely peaceful. Her own story was not simple. She had come to Kansas from the East, from a life that had promised to look very different from the one she was currently living. She had been engaged 4 years ago to a man named Henry who had been charming and educated, and had genuinely admired her intelligence right up until he had decided he wanted a wife and not a colleague. And the distinction had become clear in a way that had cost her a ring and a great deal of faith in the idea that being loved for your mind and being loved were necessarily the same thing. She did not talk about Henry. She had, in the years since, built a life that was rich with purpose and largely empty of people who got close enough to matter, and she had told herself repeatedly that this was a choice and not a loss, and most of the time she almost believed it. By the end of her second week in Millhaven, she had developed the habit of ending her working days by riding out toward the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the Dunlap property, tying her horse to a cottonwood, and spending half an hour at the water's edge with her notebook, writing up her field observations for the day while the evening light turned everything golden. It was the most beautiful hour of the Kansas day, when the heat softened and the sky went the color of a peach, and the creak made a sound like something patient and enduring. She did not know that Clayton had taken to walking the boundary fence in the evening, not until the third time she found him there, leaning on a fence post with his hat in his hand, looking at the creek with an expression that had nothing to do with irrigation. "You are going to wear a path in that fence line," she said, because she said the thing she was thinking most of the time. It was a habit she had not entirely broken. "It is my fence line," he said, without offense. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her notebook. "What are you writing?" "Field observations, soil data, notes on the pH amendment schedule for your North Quadrant." She paused. "Sometimes other things." "Other things," he said. "I write about what I see," she said. "It is how I process things. The creek is particularly interesting in the evening light, the way the water catches the last of the sun." He looked at the creek for a moment. "My father used to say that a piece of land will tell you everything about itself if you watch it long enough." "Your father was a farmer, rancher, Texas near the Guadalupe River." He paused. "He is gone now, 7 years." "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it without ceremony. "He would have told me I was a fool to plant wheat," Clayton said. He was probably right, but the cattle market has its own kind of trap, and the bank convinced me that diversification was the intelligent move. "The bank is not wrong about diversification," she said, "but the wheat should have been preceded by a proper soil assessment. If you had had accurate information about that hardpan layer before you planted, you could have corrected it first and saved yourself 2 years of partial yields." He looked at her with that particular expression she had started to recognize, the one that meant he was deciding how to receive something. "Are you telling me I should have hired an agronomist before I started?" "I am telling you that you were making decisions without complete information," she said. "That is not foolishness. It is just a limitation of not having the science available to you. The science exists now. That is why I am here." The evening light was very warm then, and the creek was doing its patient thing, and Clayton Dunlap was looking at her with storm-gray eyes that had, she realized, been doing something to her equilibrium since the morning she arrived at his door. She looked back at her notebook. "I should finish these notes while the light holds," she said. "Of course," he said, and pushed off from the fence post. He had walked perhaps 20 feet when he stopped and turned back. "There is a gathering at the miller's farm on Saturday. Most of the county comes. It is mostly a social, but there will be people there you have not met yet who could be useful for your survey." He paused. "If you wanted to go." "That sounds useful," she said carefully. "Pete and his wife usually ride over from here. You could come with them if you did not want to ride alone." "Thank you," she said. "I will think about it." He nodded and walked back toward the ranch house, and Caroline looked at her notebook, which she was no longer writing in, and noted with scientific precision that her heart was behaving unusually. She went to the Miller gathering, riding with Pete and his wife Clara, who was a warm and talkative woman from Missouri who made Caroline feel more welcome in 40 minutes of wagon conversation than she had felt in 2 weeks in Millhaven. Clara had the frontier woman's gift of taking people exactly as they were without requiring them to be anything else first, and Caroline found herself talking more freely than she usually did about her work, about the agricultural board, even briefly about Henry, which surprised her. "A man who could not appreciate what he had," Clara said flatly. "Those are the worst kind because they make you think the problem is you when it is entirely them." "I have largely come to that conclusion," Caroline said. "Good," said Clara. "Hold on to it." The Miller farm was a busy, noisy, genuinely cheerful place that evening, with long tables set out in the yard and a fiddle player who had more enthusiasm than skill, but made up for it in volume. People milled and ate and talked in the way that people who live far apart come together when they finally get the chance, with a kind of intensity of connection that was specific to frontier gatherings. Clayton was there, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the way the evening arranged itself, so that he was near her more often than not, in the way that either meant someone was paying attention, or that the social geometry of a rural gathering naturally pushed people toward the edges. She had a long conversation with a wheat farmer named Arnie Halst about his drainage problems, which were similar to Clayton's, and which she was able to address with practical specificity. And she was aware of Clayton standing nearby listening to this conversation, with an expression she had begun to think of as his learning face, the look of a man who was deciding that something was worth understanding. Later, when the fiddle player had switched to something slower, and several couples had moved to the open space that served as a dance floor, she found herself standing at the edge of the lamplight with a glass of lemonade and the comfortable feeling of having done something useful this evening. "You told Arnie Halst 3 things in 15 minutes that his county extension man has not been able to tell him in 3 years," Clayton said from beside her. "His county extension man is working from generalized recommendations," she said. "I have his actual soil data." "It is more than that," Clayton said. "You have a gift for it, for seeing the problem beneath the problem." Caroline looked at him. In the warm lamplight he looked different from the way he looked in daylight. The hard edges of him softened slightly, the storm gray of his eyes warmer. "That is a kind thing to say," she said. "I do not say kind things to be kind," he said. "I say them when they are accurate." She remembered later that this was the moment she stopped being entirely careful. She thought about that conversation for the next 2 days while she went about her work. She thought about it with the slightly alarmed attention of someone who recognizes a feeling they had decided not to have again. She had not come to Millhaven to feel anything about anyone. She had come to work, and she was working, and the work was good and clean and required all of her considerable mind, and that had always been enough before. She told herself it was proximity and an interesting man and the particular loneliness of the frontier, all perfectly explicable factors. She told herself this with the rigor she applied to soil analysis, and it did not work at all. On the Wednesday of her 3rd week, she was cataloging her soil samples in Mrs. Pruitt's back parlor when Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway with a look that combined curiosity and the frontier's peculiar form of discretion. "Clayton Dunlap rode into town this morning," she said. "He left something at the desk for you." She held out a flat paper parcel, which Caroline opened with hands that were perfectly steady and a heartbeat that was not. Inside was a book. Specifically, it was a copy of George Vesey's Agricultural Grasses of the United States, which was a government publication from 1875 that Caroline had mentioned in passing during their conversation about native prairie grasses and soil stabilization, a conversation she had not expected him to remember in any particular detail. He had not only remembered it, he had somehow gotten a copy, which in a town like Millhaven likely meant a specific and deliberate trip to a bookseller in a larger city or a careful correspondence with someone who could obtain it. There was a note inside the front cover written in a hand that was careful and straight, the handwriting of someone who had been taught to write but did not do it frequently. It said, "I thought you might not have this one. C.D." Caroline sat with this for a long moment. Then she put the book in her satchel, closed her notebooks, and rode out to the Dunlap ranch. She found him at the barn, doing something with a harness that required both hands and significant attention, which was convenient because it meant he could not quite arrange his expression as quickly as he might have. "Thank you," she said, "for the book." "It seemed useful," he said, which was almost exactly what she had said about the Miller gathering, and she thought that might be deliberate. "It is useful," she said. "It is also thoughtful. It required you to do something specific to get it." He looked at her then, and the harness was still in his hands, but neither of them was paying attention to it. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said. About decisions made without complete information." "Yes," she said carefully. "I think I have been doing that in more areas than just the wheat," he said. The silence that followed was warm and very full, and she was absolutely certain that they were no longer talking about soil science. "Clayton," she started. "I know you are here for work," he said, and his voice was careful in a way that made her understand he had rehearsed this or at least thought about it carefully. "And I know your work is important, and that You are not the kind of woman who is here to find something other than what she came here to find. I respect that more than I can say properly." "But," she said, because there was clearly a but I would like your permission to think that there might be something worth thinking about when your survey is done," he said. "If that is something you would be willing to consider." It was possibly the most careful and formal expression of interest she had ever received, and it was also, she thought, entirely honest, and she had a great weakness for honesty. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would be willing to consider it." He nodded, as though this were settled, and went back to the harness, and she stood there for another moment in the warm barn smell of hay and horse and old wood, and then she went back to her work because they were both people who did that. That evening at the creek, she wrote in her notebook for a long time, and very little of it was about soil. She was in the middle of calculating the pH amendment quantities for his northern quadrant on the Thursday morning of her third week, when she looked up at the eastern horizon and saw the cloud. She had been glancing at the sky periodically all morning, not because she was expecting anything specific, but because 3 years of fieldwork had made weather observation a reflex. The horizon to the east had been clear at 6 in the morning and at 8 and at 9:30. At 10:20 she looked east and the hair on the back of her neck stood up. The cloud was brown and dense and moving with a speed and uniformity that no weather phenomenon produced. It was alive. It was millions of individual living things moving as a single body, and Caroline Graves knew exactly what it was because she had seen it once before, in Nebraska in the summer of 1874, and she had never forgotten the particular horror of watching a swarm like that descend. She was already running before she had consciously decided to run. She covered the distance from her sample site to the ranch yard in under 4 minutes, which she could manage because she was fit, and because urgency is a remarkable accelerant of human capacity. She burst through the gate just as Clayton emerged from the barn, and she grabbed his arm, and she said what she said. And he said what he said. And then they were moving. "How much kerosene do you have?" she demanded, heading for the supply shed at a pace that required him to lengthen his stride to keep up with her, which was a thing she noticed with a remote corner of her attention. "2 barrels in the supply shed," he said. "Maybe more in the get them both, and every gunny sack you have and rope and a team hitched to the wagon. Now, Pete, Jeb, everyone you have, move." She was already at the supply shed, pulling open the door, her mind running the calculations with a speed that was almost painful. 400 acres. A swarm of this size, based on its visible dimensions and movement speed, represented a density of perhaps 1,000,000 insects per square mile. The wheat was at the most vulnerable stage possible. The heads were full and the grain was mature enough to be destroyed completely. Traditional locust treatments in 1876 were limited. There was no arsenic spray program, no coordinated government response, no modern infrastructure. What there was, and what she knew from her research and from that terrible summer in Nebraska, was a combination of fire management, physical barrier technique, and the particular use of coal tar or kerosene as a deterrent along the swarm's advance edge. It was not perfect. It would not save everything, but done correctly, done quickly, it could save enough. "Burning strips," she told Clayton as he appeared with Pete behind him, both men moving at her urgency without question now, which she registered with a deep and grateful part of her awareness. "We burn perimeter strips along the east and north edges. The smoke disrupts the swarm's flight pattern, and the fire itself destroys those that try to advance through the burning zone. We cannot stop them landing, but we can deflect the main body." "That risks the wheat at the edges," Clayton said, not objecting, just calculating. "The edge rows," she said. "We sacrifice the outer 30 feet to save the interior." "Yes." His jaw tightened for one moment. Then, "What do you need?" "Kerosene-soaked strips of burlap, which we drag along the field edges to lay a fuel line. Every man you have. And the creek water for controlled burning. We need someone positioned at the creek access with buckets to manage the fire line so it does not spread inward." She was already moving as she said this, dragging a coil of rope from the shed, her mind ahead of her hands and her feet, seeing the geometry of the operation in the same way she saw a soil composition problem, as a system that could be understood and managed if you identified the critical variables. "Jeb," Clayton called. "Get to the Millhaven Road and flag down anyone you see. We need hands." "Yes, sir," Jeb said and broke into a run. Pete was already rolling the first barrel of kerosene toward the wagon with the efficiency of a man who was good in a crisis, which Caroline was glad to observe. What happened in the next 45 minutes was one of the most extraordinary things that Clayton Dunlap had ever participated in, and would spend years afterward trying to adequately describe. It was not the emergency itself, though God knew that was significant enough. It was watching Caroline Graves coordinate it. She was everywhere and she was calm, which was the thing that stopped it from being chaos. Calm not in a passive way, not in the way of someone who had removed themselves emotionally, but in the way of a person whose training and knowledge had prepared them so thoroughly for exactly this crisis, that the crisis itself was a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be endured. She directed the laying of the kerosene line with precise measurements she kept in her head. She positioned Pete at the creek access with specific instructions about fire management. She adjusted the angle of the burning strip when the wind shifted slightly, recalculating on the spot with a speed that made Clayton's breath catch. He was working the east edge with a burning torch, laying fire to the kerosene-soaked burlap in the strip they had prepared, the smoke rising thick and dark into the air that was now filling with the sound of the swarm. A sound like nothing else, like wind and rain and something deeply wrong all at once. And he looked along the line of the field to where Caroline was directing two men who had arrived from the neighboring Halst farm, positioning them with the confidence of a general deploying a small army. The swarm hit the smoke and the fire line, and the first effect was the one she had predicted. The main body of the swarm, responding to the disruption of the smoke and heat currents, veered slightly northward, passing over the northernmost quarter of the field but not descending in the density it would have otherwise. Some portion of the swarm landed in the outer rows as she had anticipated, the sacrifice zone she had calculated into her plan, but the interior of the wheat field, the great bulk of 400 acres of harvest, was protected. Clayton was watching the swarm move over his fields with a kind of controlled terror that he was only managing because there was too much to do to stand and feel it properly. And then he looked along the burning line and saw Caroline, standing at the corner of the field where the east and north lines met, one hand shading her eyes against the smoke, watching the movement of the swarm with an absolute focus that was almost unearthly in its stillness. She was reading it. She was reading the swarm the way she read soil samples, watching the data and understanding what it meant. And as he watched, she suddenly moved, walking fast to where Pete was positioned at the creek. "Move the fire line," she called, and her voice cut through the smoke and the noise of the swarm with no effort at all. 10 feet north. The swarm is pushing back south at the vanguard edge. Move it now." Pete moved it. The men from the Halst farm moved with him. The adjustment was made in under 2 minutes and it worked. The southward push of the swarm's edge, which would have driven the insects back into the interior of the field, was deflected by the repositioned fire line, and the main body continued its northward track over the edge rows and out across the open pasture beyond. It took another hour for the bulk of the swarm to pass. During that hour, Caroline maintained the operation with a steadiness that was almost frightening in its consistency, monitoring the fire line, adjusting as needed, watching the swarm, making calculations that Clayton could not follow and did not need to follow because she was following them for all of them. When it was finally over, when the brown cloud had passed and the sky was clear again, and the smoke from the fire lines was beginning to thin, Clayton walked the outer edge of his eastern field and looked at what remained. The outer rows, as she had said, were gone. 30 feet in along the north and east edges, the wheat was stripped to bare stalk. But inside that perimeter, the field was intact. The heads were heavy and full, and the stalks stood straight in the afternoon light, 400 acres of harvest, most of it alive. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked back to where Caroline was talking with the Halst farm men, thanking them in a calm and specific way that made them stand a little straighter. And he waited until they had gone and Pete had taken the wagon back to the barn, and Jeb had returned from his flag-down mission with 2 more men from down the road who had arrived just late enough to help with the fire management. When they were finally alone in the field, he looked at her. She was dirty. Her face was streaked with smoke. Her hair had come half down from its pins, and there was a burn on the back of her right hand from where a spark had caught her when she was too close to the fire line for a moment. A burn she had not mentioned and probably would not mention. She was standing with her notebook open, writing down what had happened with the same methodical attention she gave everything, and the afternoon light was catching the smoke in the air above the wheat and making it look almost like a benediction. "Caroline," he said. She looked up. "That was the most remarkable thing I have ever seen," he said. "What you just did." She looked at him for a moment, and he saw her face do something complicated, something that he thought might be the look of a person receiving a thing they had not entirely prepared for. "The technique is documented," she said. "Fire management during locust events is recorded in the agricultural literature as early as—" "Stop," he said gently. She stopped. "I am not talking about the technique," he said. "I am talking about you, the way you knew. The way you saw it and understood it and ran here and made me trust you before I even knew I had decided to. The way you managed everything." He paused. "You saved my ranch today, not just the wheat. The bank note on this property is carried by the wheat yield. Without this harvest, I would have been in default by spring. You saved everything." Her notebook was in her hands and she was very still, and he thought he could see the emotion working through her like water finding its level, being processed by a mind that was trained to process things rigorously, and was meeting something that did not entirely yield to rigor. "I need to know," he said, "whether I am allowed to say something that has nothing to do with agronomics." "You may say it," she said quietly. "I think I am in love with you," he said. "I think it started the morning you showed up at my door and told me things about my own land that I did not know, and I think it has been getting steadily more true every day since, and I wanted you to know that before anything else happened, because the kind of secrets that live in a man's chest and never get spoken have a way of becoming problems." The afternoon was very quiet. The wheat stood around them, saved and golden and smelling of smoke. Caroline looked at him for a long time, long enough that he began to think he had miscalculated, and then she said, "I have spent 4 years telling myself that being loved for your mind and being loved were 2 different things. That I had to choose between the life I was building and the kind of love that asked me to be smaller than I am. I would not ask you to be smaller," he said. "I am not sure that would even be possible." Something shifted in her face then, something that had been held carefully for a long time releasing its tension. "I know you would not," she said. "That is the problem." He looked at her. "That is the problem." "The problem," she said very quietly, "is that I am in love with you too, and I have been trying not to be, and it has been completely unsuccessful." He took a step toward her and she did not step back, and he reached out and took the notebook very gently from her hands and set it on the nearest fence post, and she looked up at him with green eyes that were clear and certain and completely unguarded for the first time since he had met her. He kissed her in the wheat field with the smoke still in the air and the afternoon light going gold around them, and it was the kind of kiss that answered something both of them had been carrying too long. When they parted, she looked at the burn on the back of her hand with an expression that suggested she was only now noticing it properly. "You need to put something on that," he said. "It is minor," she said. "Caroline," he said. She looked at him. "Let someone take care of you," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, and whatever she saw there satisfied something in her because she said, "All right." He took her hand carefully and they walked back to the ranch house together in the late afternoon light, and Pete, who was coming out of the barn with a bucket, saw them and found something very interesting to look at in the other direction. The next weeks were a revelation to both of them in different ways. Clayton had expected that loving someone like Caroline would require certain adjustments, would require giving space in specific ways, would require the willingness to receive correction and counsel without taking it as challenge. What he had not expected was how much he would come to depend on the particular quality of her mind, not as a professional asset, but as a daily necessity, the way the habit of her thinking became inseparable from the texture of his own days. She worked. She continued her survey, finished her county-wide soil report for the Agricultural Board, submitted her findings with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did. She did not soften this or make apologies for it, and he did not expect her to. He read her reports when she let him, which was not immediately and required that he first demonstrate genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. And once he had cleared that bar, she showed him things that changed fundamentally how he understood the land he had been living on for 11 years. He understood things about her, too, that emerged over weeks of proximity. The dark past she carried about Henry was not a wound she nursed, but one she had sealed over with work and principle. And what she needed was not to have it validated or avenged, but to have it made irrelevant by evidence that contradicted it. He provided that evidence without design, simply by being the thing he was, and he watched the last traces of that old caution in her dissolve like the morning frost on the wheat stalks. She stayed in Millhaven beyond her scheduled survey completion. She told herself it was because there were follow-up measurements needed for the hardpan treatment she had prescribed for Clayton's North Field, which was true. She told herself it was because the Halst farm and 2 other properties in the county needed additional attention, which was also true. She told herself it was not because leaving had become something she did not want to do, which was the least true of the 3 things. Mrs. Prout watched all of this with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. In September, when the wheat harvest came in and the yield figures were tallied, and Clayton stood in his field office with the numbers in front of him, and a look on his face that was the particular expression of a man whose anxieties have been answered, he rode into town not to the bank first, but to Mrs. Prout's hotel, where he stood in the parlor doorway while Caroline looked up from her papers with an eyebrow raised. "The yield is the highest this property has recorded," he said. "Even accounting for the edge rows we lost to the fire line. The soil amendment in the North Quadrant showed a 14% improvement over last season. Your projections were accurate within 2% margin. 2% is within normal field variation," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to tell you." "Why?" she said, knowing perfectly well why but wanting to hear it. "Because you made it happen," he said, "and because I am proud of you and I wanted to say that to your face." She set down her pen. She looked at him standing in Mrs. Prout's parlor doorway with his hat in his hand and his gray eyes direct and warm, and she thought about the road that had brought her here, from a life that had almost been small enough to fit what other people expected of her, all the way to this particular doorway. "Clayton," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask me," she said. He blinked. Then slowly he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile without reservation, the expression transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made her breath unsteady. "Caroline Graves," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said immediately, and then, because she was herself, "with the understanding that my work continues. That I will travel when the board requires it. That my name and my research and my independent judgment are not things I will set aside. With the understanding that I will be here when you come back," he said, "and that I will read every report you write and argue with you about your conclusions when I think you are wrong, which will probably not be often." "Probably not," she agreed. "And that I am proud of who you are," he said, "every single day." She stood up from the table and crossed to where he was standing in the doorway and kissed him with a thoroughness that made the hat he was holding fall to the floor unnoticed. They were married in October, at the Millhaven Church, in a ceremony that was attended by what appeared to be most of the county, and was officiated by the minister who had known Clayton for several years, and who managed to convey in his remarks both genuine warmth for the groom and a sincere admiration for the bride that gave the whole thing a quality of rightness. Clara, Pete's wife, wept happily and made no apologies for it. Mrs. Prout did not weep, but her expression was the softened version of her usual assessing look, which amounted to the same thing. Arnie Halst made a speech that was mostly about soil amendment, but arrived eventually at congratulations, which everyone present appreciated. Caroline wore a dress that was not white but a deep blue-green that was exactly the color of the creek in the evening light, and she kept her hair up with the same practical pins she always used, but Clara had tucked small white wildflowers in among them, and the overall effect was of someone who looked entirely like herself and also completely luminous, which Clayton could not stop looking at and made no attempt to hide. He had built them a proper life at the ranch. Not a new life exactly, but an expanded one. He added to the house over the fall, an additional room that became Caroline's study, with a south-facing window for light and shelving, built to her specifications for her books and equipment, and the considerable collection of labeled soil sample jars that she could not be expected to leave behind. He built it with his own hands, the way he had built most of the house, with the same patient competence that she had been watching for months and now had entirely unfettered access to, which she found was one of the greatest pleasures of being exactly where she was. She adapted to the ranch with less difficulty and more interest than either of them had quite anticipated. She was not a farm woman in the traditional sense and did not perform farm womanhood, but she was a person who found meaning in useful work, and there was an enormous amount of useful work available, and the intersection of her agricultural knowledge with the daily reality of the property produced results that pleased both of them. She redesigned the crop rotation schedule for the eastern fields over the winter months, working at her study desk in the evenings while Clayton read, and occasionally challenged her conclusions with questions that had gotten increasingly sophisticated, which she found deeply satisfying. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong convictions, and neither of them was inclined to soften their positions out of politeness. But they argued well, with intellectual respect and without cruelty, and they generally arrived at a position that was more carefully considered than either of them had started with, which both of them recognized as better than agreement for its own sake. The winter was long and cold in the Kansas way, the wind coming down across the flat land with nothing to stop it, and the ranch house was warm and full in a way that Clayton had not quite let himself imagine was possible. He sat across the dinner table from a woman who made him think harder and feel more and be better at most of the things he cared about being good at, and when she looked up from her reading in the evening with her green eyes absent and far away in whatever she was working through, he felt the particular contentment of a man who has found the right person and knows it without equivocation. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she was happy. Not happy in the vague and provisional way she had been sometimes happy before, in the way that required her not to look at it too directly in case it turned out to be something else. Happy in a specific and grounded way, rooted in the particular place she was and the particular person she was with, and the particular work she was doing, all three of them forming something that felt complete. By spring, the Agricultural Board had sent her next assignment, a survey in the southern counties of Kansas, and she and Clayton had their first serious navigation of what their arrangement meant in practice. She would be gone for 6 weeks. He would run the ranch, manage the spring planting on the eastern fields according to the rotation schedule she had designed, and write her letters that she would receive in whatever county seat she was working from. She left on a Tuesday in late March, riding to the Millhaven depot with her equipment and her notebooks and the particular efficient packing of someone who had been doing this for years. Clayton drove her in the wagon, and neither of them was inclined toward dramatic gestures. But when she boarded the train, he held her hand on the platform for a long moment and said, "Come back with something interesting." "I always do," she said. She did come back, 6 weeks later, with a soil map of the southern counties and the preliminary findings of a study on native grass restoration that she thought had implications for the northern range management practices of the county, including his own. She also came back tired in a way that she had not expected to notice, not because the work had been harder than usual, but because home had become a specific place now, and being away from it had a particular weight. He met her at the depot and did not say anything for a moment, just looked at her with the undisguised directness that was his way, and then helped her with her equipment and drove her home. She told him about the soil maps over dinner. He asked the questions she expected him to ask, and two she did not, and they argued productively about one of her conclusions regarding subsurface clay distribution. And by the time the argument was settled and the dishes were done, the evening had the quality of something interrupted and resumed, which was its own kind of good. In September of the following year, she told him she was going to have a child. She told him with her characteristic directness, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with her coffee cup in her hand, and he looked at her for a moment in the way that the largest moments sometimes produced in him, a stillness that was the outward sign of something moving very fast inside. Then he put his own coffee cup down very carefully and said, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "Slightly tired, otherwise entirely myself." He nodded, and something in his face that she had not seen before appeared and settled there, something warm and fundamental. "Good," he said, and then, "That is wonderful, Caroline." She had been uncertain, not about wanting the child, but about how the arrival of a child would negotiate with everything else she was, her work, her independence, the particular shape of the life she had built. She found in the months that followed that Clayton approached this the same way he approached everything she had brought into his life, not as something to be managed or contained, but as something to be understood and supported. He did not suggest that her work should pause. He did not treat her as fragile. He did take on more of the physical work of the property without discussion, and when she commented on this, he said simply that the work needed doing and he was here to do it, which was the kind of statement that was quietly enormous. Their son was born in June of 1878, on a warm night when the wheat was high and the creek was full, and the air smelled of the summer that was coming in. He was large and healthy and had his father's lungs, which was evident within the first 30 seconds, and Clayton held him with the careful steadiness of a man who understood the weight of important things. They named him Thomas, after Clayton's father, which was Caroline's suggestion, and which made Clayton quiet in the particular way that meant something had gotten through to a deep place. Thomas Dunlap was an energetic and curious child who, by the time he was walking steadily, showed a startling interest in the soil sample jars in his mother's study, and had to be relocated from their lower shelves twice before Caroline moved them up and put field guides in their place, which he liked nearly as well. He was also, from early on, fascinated by the horses, which meant he spent a great deal of time near his father, who had the infinite patience with him that large and capable men sometimes have with very small and determined people. Caroline continued her work for the Agricultural Board throughout Thomas's early years, structuring it around the growing seasons and the demands of the ranch, finding arrangements that were imperfect and workable and constantly adjusted, as all living arrangements are. She published 2 papers in agricultural journals during this period, one on hardpan soil remediation and one on drought resistance in Kansas wheat varieties, which brought her enough professional attention that she was invited to speak at the Kansas State Agricultural College, which she did, riding the train to Manhattan with her notes and her confidence, and returning 3 days later with the particular energized look of a person who has just done something that fully engaged them. Clayton read both papers. He argued with her about one conclusion in the first one and was eventually persuaded that she was right, which he acknowledged without ceremony, and she appreciated without excessive gratitude. 3 years after Thomas was born, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Ruth, who was born in winter with dark eyes and the deliberate steadiness that would prove to be her permanent temperament. Thomas regarded her with a 2-year-old's mixture of intense interest and mild suspicion that resolved, within a few weeks, into a protective attentiveness that both parents found secretly amusing. The ranch grew in the years that followed. Not dramatically, not through acquisition or aggression, but through the steady compounding of good decisions and sound management, and the specific application of Caroline's soil science to the property that produced yields consistently above the county average. The hardpan in the North Quadrant had been fully remediated by the second year of treatment, exactly as she had predicted, and the yield improvement had been substantial enough that the banknote was paid off 3 years ahead of schedule, which was the kind of outcome that made a man sleep differently. Clayton built out the study further as her book collection outgrew its shelves. He added a laboratory bench with a marble top because she needed a flat, non-reactive surface for her chemical analysis work, which he sourced from a supplier in Kansas City with a specific correspondence that arrived as a complete surprise to her one October morning. She stood at the bench for a moment touching the surface, and then turned and looked at him and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent she had ever been. There were difficulties, as there always are. A drought year in 1881 that required the emergency implementation of every water conservation technique she knew, and which still cost them a portion of the yield and a great deal of sleep. A dispute with a neighboring rancher named Caldwell who objected to Caroline's testimony at a county water board hearing about subsurface water rights, testimony that was factual and devastating to his position, and that he took personally enough to make things difficult for several months. Clayton had dealt with this with the quiet, immovable patience of a man who is confident in the person he is defending, and the dispute had eventually run its course when Caldwell needed a good agronomist to diagnose his own failing crops, and had to come to Caroline through a third party because he could not quite bring himself to ask her directly. She had helped him anyway, because the crops were not responsible for the dispute, and Caldwell had the particular dignity to acknowledge this in a way that ended the difficulty between them. In the summer of 1883, a young woman came to Millhaven from the Agricultural College, a student agronomist doing field work, and came to the Dunlap Ranch with a letter of introduction that was partly from the college and partly from Caroline's old supervisor at the Agricultural Board, who had written that there was no better field mentor available in the state. Caroline took her on for the summer with the brisk thoroughness of someone who knew exactly how to teach, because she remembered exactly what it was to learn, and Clayton watched his wife instruct this young woman with the same patience and clarity she brought to everything, and found that the feeling this produced in him was somewhere between admiration and something even larger. Thomas, by this time, was 5 years old, and had developed the particular opinion that the summer student was fascinating. She handled this with a patience that suggested she had younger siblings, and Caroline watched Thomas follow her around the fields with a look that suggested she found this funnier than she intended. The summer student, whose name was Margaret, went back to the college in August with field notes that would form the basis of a distinguished career, and with the understanding, stated plainly in a letter she sent Caroline that winter, that she intended to be the kind of agronomist that Caroline was, which was the highest professional compliment Caroline had received, and she kept that letter in the drawer of her study desk. On the evening of their 7th anniversary, Clayton and Caroline sat on the porch of the ranch house in the late summer dark, the children asleep inside, and the stars spread across the Kansas sky in the particular density that the absence of city light permitted. The wheat in the eastern field was harvested, the season's work done, and the night was warm enough to sit outside without coats and quiet enough to hear the creek if you listened. Caroline had her notebook with her because she almost always had her notebook, but she was not writing in it. She was just sitting, watching the stars with her shoulder against Clayton's arm and the night around them. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the spring survey the board wants me to do in the western counties." She paused. "Thomas is old enough to travel now in another 2 years. I was thinking that we might go as a family, some of it at least, if you could leave Pete in charge of the ranch for a month." He was quiet for a moment. "A working trip. A working trip that would let you see the kind of land I spend time in," she said. "The dryland wheat country to the west. I think you would find it interesting." "I would find anything interesting that you found interesting," he said, which was both a joke and entirely true. "You are being romantic," she said. "It is our anniversary," he said. "I am allowed." She turned her head and looked at him in the dark, this man who had stood in a wheat field on a smoky afternoon and said he was in love with her, who had built her a study and read her papers and argued with her conclusions, and held her hand through a difficult winter when the drought was threatening everything they had built, who had never once in 7 years asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. "Clayton," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad the locusts came," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that began as surprise and resolved into something so warm it made her chest ache. "That is possibly the most Caroline Graves thing you have ever said," he said. "It is honest," she said. "If they had not come, I might have finished my survey and gone on to the next county, and neither of us would have known what we were missing. I would have found a reason," he said, "even without the locusts. The book was already ordered." "The book," she said, and the warmth in her voice was unmistakable. "You had ordered that book before the locusts." "I had," he said. "I told you. I was working with incomplete information for a long time before you arrived. Once I had better information, I made the obvious decision." She laughed, and it was the laugh of a woman who was comprehensively happy, soft and real in the warm night air. "The hardpan remediation is complete in all 4 quadrants," she said after a moment of comfortable silence. "I know," he said. "Your yields have been above county average for 4 consecutive years. I know that too. The bank note is cleared. The drought damage from '81 has been fully recovered." "Caroline," he said gently. "Yes," she said. "I know," he said. "I know all of that. What I know more than any of that is what it took to get here, and who it was beside me every step of the way." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not say it enough," she said finally, because she was honest and honesty required this too. "That I am grateful, not for what you have done but for who you are to me. It is not a thing I say easily." "I know," he said. "That is why I pay very close attention to the times when you say it." She reached over and found his hand in the dark and held it, which was her own particular language for the things that outran words. The stars turned slowly over the Kansas wheat fields, over the healed hardpan and the amended soil, and the crop rotation schedule pinned above the desk in Caroline's study, over the sleeping children and the repaired fence line, and the creek that ran patient and unchanged through all the years of human activity on its banks. The ranch was quiet in the way that a full and functioning and genuinely good life is quiet at night, with the particular peace of something built carefully and kept well. 2 years later, they did make the Western Survey trip, traveling as a family to the dryland country to the west with Thomas, who was 7 by then and full of opinions about everything he saw, and Ruth, who was 4 and watched the landscape from the wagon with the serious eyes of a child taking inventory. Caroline worked her survey with Thomas increasingly at her elbow, asking questions. She answered thoroughly and without condescension. And Clayton watched his son and his wife moving through the wheat fields of the western counties with the same attentiveness he had watched Caroline alone 7 years before. Thomas Dunlap, it emerged over the following years, had inherited his mother's particular quality of perception, the ability to see the problem beneath the problem, though in his case it expressed itself first through an interest in the mechanical side of the agricultural work, the machinery and the engineering problems of the ranch, before cycling back around in his early adult years to a genuine interest in land management that delighted Caroline and surprised no one who had been paying attention. Ruth Dunlap had, from an early age, a gift for the social arithmetic of people that neither of her parents possessed in quite the same form, an ability to understand what people needed, and how to say the right thing at the right moment that made her a mediator of impressive skill by the time she was 10, which came in useful in more than one situation involving her brother's strong opinions about how things should be done, and the approximately equal strength of her mother's opposing convictions. Clayton, watching his family across the dinner table on an autumn evening when Thomas was 12 and Ruth was 9, and Caroline was across from him with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and her notes spread around her plate in the way that always happened when she was deep in something, thought that his father had been right about one thing, that a piece of land would tell you everything about itself if you watched it long enough. But he had been wrong to suggest this was particular to land. It was true of people too, perhaps more true, and what the years had told him about Caroline Graves, now Caroline Dunlap though she published under Graves and always had and always would, was that she was the most interesting and capable and infuriating and fundamentally good person he had ever known, and that the life they had built together was the most valuable thing he possessed, more than the land or the yield numbers or the cleared bank note, more than any of the measurable things. He said this to her that night when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, not with the careful formal speech of 7 years before, but with the simplicity of someone who has been keeping something true for a long time and wants it said plainly. She looked at him across the cleared table and took off her reading glasses and set them down. "I know," she said, and then because she was Caroline, "I have known for a long time." "Tell me how long," he said. "Since the creek bank," she said. "The third time you walked the fence line in the evening." He was quiet for a moment. "That was before the Locusts." "It was before the Locusts," she confirmed. "You never said anything." "Neither did you," she said. "We were both working with incomplete information." He smiled at her across the table, the unreserved smile that she had first seen in Mrs. Pruitt's parlor doorway, the one that transformed his face and still, all these years later, did something irrevocable to her own heartbeat. "We figured it out," he said. "We did," she said. "We had good data to work with once we stopped being careful." Outside, the autumn wind moved through the Kansas wheat country, over the fields that were sleeping now, resting through the winter in the way that healthy soil rests, replenishing and preparing for the next season's abundance. The creek ran in the dark past the eastern boundary fence, patient as it always was. The stars were out in their Kansas density, undimmed. Inside the ranch house that Clayton Dunlap had built with his own hands, and expanded for the books and the laboratory bench and the children and everything else that had come into it, the lamps were burning warm, and the life that two people had made from a plague cloud on the horizon and 45 minutes of crisis, and the particular courage of being honest about what you felt was whole and full and entirely at peace. Caroline Graves had arrived in Millhaven, Kansas, in July of 1876 with her notebooks and her microscope, and her absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. She had saved a harvest and found a home, which was perhaps not the survey result the Agricultural Board had anticipated, but was, by any measurement she trusted, the most significant finding of her career. The wheat stood waiting in the dark fields, and spring would come, and the work would go on, and everything that mattered was right here.